Hello, I'm Luis Carrasco, Deputy Opinion Editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer, stepping in as today's host for today's discussion. Over the next hour, Trudy Rubin and I will address questions on the Hamas-Israel war, where things stand, Israel's strategy, the humanitarian cost, and what comes after the war. Trudy Rubin has been covering this subject for decades. She was Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor before coming to the Inquirer. She's been a Pulitzer finalist in 2001 for columnist. She wrote on Israel and the Palestinians, and a finalist again in 2017. She also won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary on International News in 2018. Trudy, I'm delighted to moderate this important and very fraught discussion.
Thanks very much, Luis. Yes, indeed, very fraught.
Well, before we get started, I just want to say, if you want to submit, viewers can submit questions to Trudy in the comment section below. Or if you're watching us online, you can go to inquirer.com/live and submit your questions for Trudy. Thank you again for doing this, Trudy. I know I really appreciate it. I always get smarter after I talk with you, so thank you.
So, where to begin?
Where to begin? How about, where are we now? Where does the war stand?
Right. Well, this was always going to be a very difficult and messy situation. As you all know in the audience, the attack on Israel was stunning, unexpected, horrific, bloody, and has shaken Israel in a way that I have never seen in all my decades of covering Israel and the Palestinian issue. People are really freaked out, even people who have long fought for a peaceful solution of two states, Palestinian and Israeli side by side, and certainly people on the right and the nationalist religious right. And so on the Israeli side, there is a thirst for the destruction of Hamas entirely. And Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, under fire for having governed the country during a time when the military and the intelligence totally failed to foresee this attack, or foresaw and didn't believe, so didn't do the necessary to prevent it, is promising Israelis that they are going to be able, Israel is, to totally wipe out Hamas. On the other hand, Hamas is embedded in the population and in a network of tunnels 300 miles underneath Gaza in a tiny space the size of Philadelphia in square miles, and with 2.2 million population. The question was always, how could this be done if Israel went in full bore, and what would be the civilian cost? So where are we now? Israel has made a strategic decision, or a tactical decision by the military, not to try to go into the tunnels, because that would create huge losses. They are no doubt booby-trapped. And so Israel is doing a level of bombing that, as you probably know, has led to 17,000 casualties, according to the Hamas-controlled health ministry. But they have a pretty good reputation for statistics, they're bureaucrats, and which has basically destroyed much of the housing stock and forced the population into the south at Israel's orders, supposedly to find safety. But there is no safety. And now Israel is mounting a ground operation in the south, and the population basically doesn't know where to go. We can go in that further, but the result is that insufficient humanitarian aid is coming in, and the population has nowhere to hide. Hospitals, I think there's 11 functional hospitals at partial strength. People are sleeping out on the ground. And none of the supposed plans that Israel has put forth for safety of the population work. Most people's phones aren't working. They don't have electricity if they're out in schools or in mosques. And so it's a horrific civilian situation. But at the same time, Israel is far, far, far from having defeated Hamas. It's not clear if that's even possible. And so at this point, just to round out this summary, the Biden administration is pressing Israel to come up with a different humanitarian situation for safe zones and the entry of aid. Netanyahu basically is barely listening, and it's unclear where this is going.
Well, before we continue, we have a question from a viewer. They ask, was the attack really unexpected? Apparently, they have heard that Israel knew about the plans for the attack. And also, why did it take 8 hours or more for Israel to respond to the attack of October 7th?
The aid was unexpected because of the inability of the intelligence agencies and the military to make use of the data that was in front of their faces, because there was a strong belief that Hamas had been bought off. I'll get to that in a second, that they were incapable of doing any operation like this, and that Israel's sophisticated technology along the border with cameras and balloons and had visibility of what was going on, and therefore there was nothing to worry about. So when the event happened, it was on a holiday weekend, a big family holiday of Shavuot, and many people in the military bases around the border were off for the long weekend at home. Those border posts had been downgraded in numbers because they were considered not vital, and those troops were moved to the West Bank, where most people, including myself, who thought that the Palestinian issue would blow up, thought the blow up would happen. So inadequately manned, absolutely unable to imagine that this could happen. And one of the saddest elements is that young women soldiers stationed along the border had been seeing unusual activity. They knew that their surveillance balloons were out of order. They had been seeing mock-ups of Hamas attacks, and they had reported this to their superiors. But these young women were not taken seriously and were told this was just role playing by Hamas, and their commander's report was ignored. I know the New York Times also had a story, which is not new, that there had been a report a year earlier, which we don't know if Netanyahu ever saw, that there could be an operation like this. But again, all of that falls into the same template, which is Israel didn't believe that Hamas could do it. And the Netanyahu government had also allowed Qatar to fund the Hamas government. They have to pay all these bureaucrats who do services. And the funding, the thinking was in Jerusalem, was buying off Hamas, which was content to sort of govern the strip and had given up the idea of attacking Israel. Just a total abject failure of intelligence and of military command paying attention to all the accumulated evidence that they refused to take seriously.
Thank you. So this question might seem a little basic, but sometimes it's good to step back a little bit. If you could tell us, what is Hamas, right? They're terrorists. They run the government. How are they different from the Palestinian Authority, for example?
Yes, I mean, a lot of people in Israel, including in the Netanyahu government, insists that Gaza is all Hamas, that the population is all complicit, because Hamas was elected the last time the Palestinians had elections for parliament, which was 2005. Hamas got a plurality of the vote. I was traveling to Israel regularly in those times, and the West Bank, and even to Gaza before Hamas took over. And in actual fact, the vote was only a plurality. And in Gaza, it was basically because the Palestinian Authority in Gaza was corrupt, and people expected that a religious party would be more honest. I mean, little did they know. But this was not a vote for Hamas's charter necessarily. And frankly, when I used to go to Gaza more regularly in the 90s, when their major opponent, the Fatah party, part of the PLO, was in charge, I heard lots of complaints then against Hamas, and Fatah fighters would say, why doesn't Arafat get rid of Hamas? All right, that never happened. Fast forward to when Hamas was elected. In 2007, the United States encouraged Fatah fighters who were still in Gaza to try to take over from Hamas by force. And that failed miserably, and the Fatah fighters were forced out. So then Hamas was in charge of the Strip, basically as an autocratic operation. The thing about Hamas is it really is a terrorist organization in the sense that it has carried out many attacks in the past. In the 1990s, when there was a chance at a peace process and the PLO was negotiating, Hamas carried out bus bombings and cafe bombings that helped start to turn the population against peace talks. And Hamas, in its charter, calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of all Jews in Palestine. It's right there in the charter. You can read it. And I have read it. But from the middle 2000s on, there was no way the Palestinian population could get rid of Hamas. There were never new elections. There weren't new elections because basically the Israeli government didn't want them. They wanted to keep Gaza and the West Bank separated, not as one unity that was pushing for a Palestinian state under the PLO. And the PLO in the West Bank didn't want them because they were afraid Hamas might win again. And so the people in Hamas were just stuck. I was in Israel in April, not long before the Hamas invasion, and people there joked to me, if there was an election today, Hamas would lose in Gaza because the people are sick of their ineffective, corrupt government, and they'd win in the West Bank because people are sick of the PLO corruption. And in fact, a poll was taken by a fairly reputable Palestinian outfit that was released on October 6th that showed that a majority of the people in Gaza wanted to get rid of the Hamas government. But then came October 7th. So I think it's fair to say it's a terrorist organization, but why do the polls now show large-scale support for Hamas in Gaza? And, you know, as this war goes on, who knows what people will really feel. But such polls as there are, I think, reflect more that Palestinians are stunned that Hamas was actually able to cross the line and get into Israel and fight off small amounts of Israeli troops and do as much damage as they did. If you look at Hamas websites, which is a lot of what people in Gaza would see, initially they showed a lot of the atrocities that they did. They were proud of it. But now it's more about Hamas fighters, Hamas victories. And I think there's this sense, as the civilian casualties mount higher and higher, that Hamas is the only fighting force that's capable of fighting back against Israelis. So to sum it all up, all of Gaza is not supporters of Hamas, but the population has basically been in a box for years with an Israeli blockade, with no way to get in or out without Israeli permission, and with no alternative, no elections, and now in a hideous humanitarian catastrophe with no housing, no food and water. And so if there's support for Hamas, I think it's mainly out of the fact that right now Hamas is seen as the only fighting force capable of hitting back at Israel. How the population will look at Hamas in the future, I think, is a very open question.
To that point, does Hamas have a future? I mean, can Israel destroy it militarily?
I think this is really the question of the hour. A lot of military experts before Israel went in full bore to Gaza argued that, and these were experts in opposition to the Netanyahu government, argued that Hamas was an idea as well as a terrorist organization. The idea of fighting for a Palestinian state. Now, as I said, Hamas is fighting for a state from the river to the sea, in their interpretation, meaning no more state of Israel and kill the Jews in the state. But I think on a broader plane, people in Gaza are desperate. People in the West Bank are desperate. And so they are more than ever desperate for some kind of a state, whether it's a two-state solution or, in their minds, a one-state solution with Jews, or supporting Hamas for a one-state without Jews. But the idea of not keeping the status quo, especially after what's happening in Gaza now, is burning bright. So even if Israel could kill some of the leadership, a lot of the fighters in Gaza, the idea of continuing to fight for a Palestinian state, of not accepting the status quo of occupation, has been renewed, reinvigorated. And I don't think you can defeat Hamas militarily unless you can convince the public that there is another avenue towards negotiating for a Palestinian state. Negotiations have been dead, basically, for almost a couple of decades. And even though the idea of two states seems impossible now, if after this war, whether Hamas is completely wiped out, which I think is almost impossible, or whether it goes to ground and you have new people popping up to replace the dead leaders, organizing underground, whether in remaining tunnels or just within the population. I think without a horizon of a political solution, you're bound to have a Hamas 2.0, no matter how long it takes for them to reemerge, or what their objective is, or whether they are a terrorist group such as Hamas is, or whether they embrace other means.
Well, let's talk about what Israel is doing in Gaza. Why are civilian casualties so high and the humanitarian humanitarian aid so low? Should there be a ceasefire?
this I have wrestled with this question in my own mind, and I have been against a permanent ceasefire in my thinking, because I think that a permanent ceasefire is basically a concession to Hamas that's overwhelming. It will be portrayed as a Hamas victory at this point now. And I think that's dangerous, because I think it emboldens the idea that Israel cannot fight off military means to establish a Palestinian state, which encourages the idea that you can get rid of the state of Israel, not just of the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza. And less people say that Gaza wasn't occupied. That's disingenuous, because Israel controlled the sea, the land borders, and in theory, the sky. Gaza was never allowed to have a port or an airport until Hamas broke through in the sky and the land. But it was basically an open air prison. But if you don't embrace a full scale halt right now, and let me add, I might think it was conceivable if all the hostages would be released without any trade. But Hamas has made clear that's not on. They want to get thousands of Palestinian prisoners out of jail, much more serious cases than the women and teenagers who were released up until now, and who haven't, most of them, been formally charged. So I don't think that's likely. However, I think there is no question that there must be a longer humanitarian pause than the week last time, and perhaps a sequence of those, because the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is simply insupportable, not just from a moral perspective, a perspective of international law, and simply that the world cannot sit by and watch 1.5 million people, maybe not every single Gazan, but most of them, dying of lack of medical care, lack of health care, lack of water, lack of food, and soon disease, because winter is coming and thousands and thousands of people living in the rough. Israel never designated clear safe zones. They keep having people move from pillar to post. And yes, it will make their military operation harder. But the situation, the strategy they're pursuing is insupportable. And just, last point, it may indeed become necessary for Israel to pull back at some point and just go in on targeted raids while the population is restored to some kind of minimal living standards, so that we don't have mass deaths, not just by bombs and military means, in the coming months. So I'm saying no permanent ceasefire, but as the U.S. has asked for, long-term humanitarian ceasefires. And right now, Netanyahu, although he has received such warm and understanding support from Joe Biden, is reacting to that as he has reacted to other U.S. requests in the past, with only tiny concessions, and basically coming out publicly and rejecting just about everything that Biden has asked for.
Well, we do have a question from a viewer saying, is it fair to say that Israel routinely ignores U.S. requests?
I don't think those requests are ignored overall, but I think that Netanyahu, who is trying to save his own reputation, since most Israelis hold him accountable for this terrible failure on October 7th, and he has accepted no accountability and is trying to keep power and prevent going to jail for corruption, has, to an extent that amazes me, although it doesn't surprise me, rejected what Biden has asked for. In the past, the U.S., including Donald Trump, has rejected Netanyahu demands that the United States come in and lead a war against Iran. Right now, the U.S. is rejecting Israeli requests, I think, that U.S. take a more aggressive stand against the attacks by Iranian-funded militias in Yemen, the Houthis, in Iraq, and in Syria, who are lobbing missiles or drones at U.S. bases or at ships entering the Red Sea, which is a crucial waterway where much of the world's oil traverses. And the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in a war in Yemen. And Israel, I think, is pushing the U.S. to be more aggressive in striking in Yemen or even in Iran. So to some extent, the U.S. has resisted Bibi, but when it comes to the Netanyahu government agreeing to U.S. demands, such as settlement freezes, stopping violence by violent settlers on the West Bank, and other extremely aggressive tactics by some of Netanyahu's cabinet ministers, which basically look like they want to stir up another war in the West Bank, for reasons I can discuss, the U.S. has made little headway. And I think the Biden government is going to have to be tougher, although it's tricky because often Israel doesn't respond to that, and in response tries to stir up the Republicans to attack any Democratic government. I think that Netanyahu, like Putin, is waiting for Trump in the hope that a Trump government will give Israel a carte blanche to do anything it pleases, which I think could actually drag the United States into a Mideast war.
Let's talk about civilians and what's happening. You've been very clear in your writing, your shock, your horror, your condemnation of the attacks on October 7th. But I've also noticed stronger and stronger language regarding civilian casualties in your columns. How long do you think Israel can push this strategy, this tactic, before it just becomes the pariah of the world?
I think if Israel continues to refuse to the Biden administration's urgings, it's going to wind up at the end of a UN Security Council vote where the U.S. finally doesn't cast the lone veto in support of Israel. There was just a vote last week, and of the 15 Security Council members, 13 voted for a ceasefire. Britain abstained, and the U.S. was the only no. Things are really getting so bad that the U.S. is in a bind now that I think it is going to find itself, compelled to take a harder position. Also on weaponry, the U.S., even though an overall appropriation for military aid to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan and the border, not military aid on the border, has been basically pushed aside by the GOP. the United States is transferring a lot of ammunition through a presidential directive to Israel, even though Ukraine probably needs it more right now. And that is a truly desperate necessity, unless we want a Putin victory, which could change the entire Western world. So I don't know if that veto could change Netanyahu's mind and his military strategy, but the debacle, the humanitarian debacle in Israel, is beginning to make, or has gone a long way towards making Israel an international pariah, and even shaking the support from its closest European allies. Now, a lot of that pariahdom, I think, is unjustified. I think that, as I've said, Hamas has to be opposed. I support Israel's efforts to destroy Hamas. But the question is, as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has asked, are you creating more future Hamas members than you are killing? If you have a civilian catastrophe where, and this has been written in the Israeli press, and Israel is still a troubled democracy because the Israeli press has been investigating this. Israel has changed its own rules of operation in terms of bombing civilians in Gaza during wartime. Israel has gone into Gaza before in response to Hamas rocket attacks on their cities, and there have always been restrictions not to bomb buildings if there were more than a certain amount of civilians there, even if you suspected there might be a key Hamas operative, not even necessarily a top operative. Now, those restrictions have been lifted, according to Israeli media investigations, and Israel can bomb a high-rise if it thinks that there might be one medium-level Hamas operative in there killing hundreds of people. And also homes can be bombed. And since the underground tunnels are the target, if you think there might be a tunnel, you can take down everything on top of it, even a lot of civilians with it. This just can't go on. And people say that such casualties were common during World War II, that this is just the casualties of war. But frankly, you look at the size of Gaza and the fact that there is no way for civilians to get out. There is no way for them to avoid the bombs. And it's a different situation. And some people will say, well, let them go to Egypt. But the fact is that Egypt is not opening its small gate, its one border entrance, because the fear is that then Israel would basically drive out 2 million Gazans into the desert in Israel. And Egypt, which is a poor country, which is now housing millions of refugees from the Sudan civil war, would suddenly be faced with this enormous refugee problem that it has to support and pay for, including many Hamas fighters, which then might take off after the Cairo government. So these civilians are trapped, and half of them are children. And it's just not on. And moreover, I don't think that it is possible for Israel to stay in Gaza in the manner it's there now and keep killing civilians in an unlimited fashion, which is the reality, contrary to the claims of the Israeli Defense Forces. You just have to look at the ground. You drop leaflets and tell people to go to place X, and they go and they're still bombing. Or you put announcements on the internet, which hundreds of thousands of people who are sheltering outdoors have no access to. So it's not the truth. You can't go on for months. And that was the original Israeli intent. Go on and on and on. And by then, the civilian population would be decimated. So this is a long-winded strategy of saying that the full-bore ground invasion can't go on indefinitely. Biden has said it clearly. The U.S. would like it to end by the end of the year. The Israelis are saying it's going to go on for months. There has to be some give there. And I think the U.S. is going to have to undertake more serious measures, like putting restrictions on arms and vetoing or voting for a ceasefire resolution that basically is not the best way to handle it. Maybe it'll be reworded as temporary. But that's what's going to happen unless Israel changes tactics and strategy soon.
You mentioned Donald Trump earlier, but we don't have to get into that too much. But could this war lead to a wider regional war? Hezbollah in the north, war with Iran. How could it spin out? That was a fear early on. We're into it a little now. Has that fear eased, or has it only gotten worse?
I think what we saw initially, and for the first weeks of this war, is that Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Shiite militia that controls the south of Lebanon and really the government of the country, and is backed and armed by Iran, Hezbollah limited its attacks into Israel because its Iranian backer was cautious and didn't want to move towards a possible outright confrontation with Israel. And in part because Hezbollah itself, in 2006, engaged in a wider war with Israel. And Israel responded by bombing much of southern Lebanon, including Lebanese civilian villages. And Hezbollah is much more responsive to its own community than Hamas is to its community. And people were quite angry afterwards because there was enormous destruction in southern Lebanon, similar to what's happening now in Gaza. Gulf money, not so much Iranian money, but money from Qatar, which sympathizes with Iran, or has good relations, and which has funded Hamas, replace this housing. But I think Hezbollah is cautious about risking another massive destruction. So there's war on the northern border, but it's within boundaries. Hezbollah, which has 150,000 missiles, thank you, Tehran, is not lobbing them into cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv, which could do immense destruction because it has so many missiles that probably some more of them would penetrate Israel's Iron Dome missile system. And now, however, the risk is that Hamas from the beginning called on Hezbollah to support them. One of Hamas's hopes was to start a war on all Israel's fronts, to have the West Bank blow up in a bigger war, to have the Hezbollah in the north lobbing missiles, causing Israel to have to fight on three fronts. So it would be much harder to come into Gaza, and it would be much more problematic for Israel, perhaps ultimately leading the Iranian leadership to feel that the moment of truth had come. That hasn't happened. And however, the more this civilian slaughter goes on, the more embarrassing it becomes for Hezbollah not to get further involved. And so I think, number one worry, both among sane people in Israel and in Washington, is that Hezbollah could still get sucked in. Number two the longer this war goes on with massive civilian deaths in Gaza, the more emboldened Iran gets to give the green light to Iranian armed militias in other Middle Eastern countries that are in a position to threaten Israel or the United States. And so, as I said before, you have Houthis threatening an international waterway in the Red Sea, and that also runs along Saudi Arabia and goes up to the Suez Canal. You have still American bases in Iraq and small ones in Syria to protect against the return of ISIS. Those are being targeted by Shiite militias in those countries. And there also is a fear the United States sent aircraft carriers off southern Lebanon to try to dissuade Iran and Hezbollah from launching a real war in the north. And there is a fear that if that war starts, American ships would become embroiled in that, and aircraft. So there is really a chance that this could expand if this war, as Israel is waging it, goes on as it is going on with the slaughter of civilians, and still unable to say, truly, it hasn't gotten any of the Hamas leaders. And there's no way that you can say right now that Hamas is under control. So this is more pressure for a different strategy. And I just add one other factor. Israeli towns along the northern border have been evacuated. And the longer this goes on, the more pressure this is, because you have about 150,000 people who are living in hotels. And this is in addition to the people along the Gaza border who were slaughtered, and the remnants of their villages and towns are also pulled out and are living in hotels. But if you focus on the north, those northern residents of cities and villages are not going to go back as long as there's a threat of a big war in the north. And so right now they're stuck. And unless this whole issue is resolved in some way, the longer it goes on, the more danger that Israel might feel it has to attack Hezbollah prematurely. And there are some Israeli generals and some Israeli ministers who are calling for that. And the US is very strongly against it, because it could involve us, but also because it starts a whole other war that could bring in Iran. So the longer this goes on, the more potential for more military action in the region, which God knows where it would go, and which it might involve the United States.
Wow. So how is it affecting Israeli relations with Arab states?
I mean, it's an interesting question because, as most of the listeners know, Israel has peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt. The Abraham Accords extended those more or less to Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco. However, and there was a hope shortly before this war started that Saudi Arabia might normalize relations with Israel and not require as a precondition that Israel agree to any new peace negotiations or any serious change in the occupation. Just, throw in some money, but nothing serious. That has all shifted in many ways. It is clear that the countries that have peace treaties with Israel, Egypt and Jordan, are desperate not to have to disavow them. Strategically, they are not interested in conflict with Israel, but they are in a terrible bind. The Egyptian government has said that if Israel pushes 2 million or 1 million Palestinians into the Sinai Desert, which is part of Egypt, out of Gaza, that would change their whole relationship with Israel. And Jordan, the king, is terrified because the last thing he wants is Israel forcing the Palestinian population to flee the West Bank into Jordan. That could totally lead to an overthrow of his monarchy. As for the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates doesn't want to renege on its good relations with Israel, but those states are being embarrassed. And then we come to Saudi Arabia. At this point, there's no way you're going to have normalization with Saudi Arabia, even if the crown prince there doesn't care for the Palestinians, which he doesn't. There is no way he can do it now. The population is up at arms over the civilian casualties. This is out there every day on Arab television: dead babies, fathers weeping, whole extended families of 20 or 30 sobbing. The Hamas horrific killings of Israelis is not on Arab television. But even if it were, the scenes are so horrific in Gaza that it wouldn't change things. The feeling is this must stop. So the question is, how does this affect future Arab relations with Israel? Many opposition Israelis hope that the Arab countries will come together and somehow present a solution, like that they would mobilize a peace force that would go into Gaza and the Israelis could pull out. Well, there's an Arab expression, and forgive me to Arab. I ask Arabic speakers to forgive me because I'll pronounce it incorrectly, but Bokra fil mishmish, and it means tomorrow with apricots, which means it ain't going to happen. Nobody is going to go into Gaza while there is still fighting, while Israeli troops are either there or are going to be coming back in raids after they pulled out. So there's going to be tension with the Arab countries. And the big question of the moment, I think, is really whether Iran-backed forces, militias, will be forced up the ante, and that will lead to a regional war. I think as far as Israel's Arab neighbors, there is stasis. The one open question is whether the Saudis might come up with a peace formula for a two-state solution. They put one forth back 20 years ago. I doubt it. I think that the Arab states who have either de facto or de jure relations with Israel are just trying to hold on to their seats and hoping desperately that this war will end. But the Abraham Accords intent, which is you were going to have an outside-in peace where all the Arab states would make peace with Israel and they wouldn't give a hoot about what happened in the West Bank and Gaza, which would have to accept their fate as occupied or semi-occupied territories. That idea, which President Trump and his son-in-law shared, that idea is over. There's no way now that Saudi Arabia can make peace, normalize with Israel, and ignore the Palestinian issue. What Hamas has achieved, if I can use that word advisedly, is one of its goals, which is the Palestinian issue is back on the table. Now the question is, where does that issue go from here? But unlike before the tragedy of October 7th, for all of those Israelis who were killed, tortured, raped, and kidnapped, the tragedy of that day has resulted in the Palestinian issue back on the table. And the question is, what comes next?
Yeah. Well, to that, we don't know when or how the war will end, but what do you think will come afterward?
I mean, I can only mention some of the suggestions that are coming out from think tanks, from Israeli opposition. A lot of it, I think, is totally impossible in the short run. Let me say, just in the start, before I go into what's impossible in the short run, before this war, it was an accepted truism by most Israelis, and I think most observers who pay attention to Israel and the Palestinians, that the two-state solution, meaning two states side by side, recognizing each other, living in peace, was dead. That led to the focus on a one-state reality. One-state reality meaning that Israel wasn't going to give up the West Bank or Gaza, so then what? For terrorist groups like Hamas, from the river to the sea meant the end of the state of Israel, because they were now in charge of more Arabs than Jews in that one state area, and ultimately the Arabs would rise up and drive them out. For the Netanyahu government, which is controlled by radical national supremacist parties, it meant a one-state solution where Israel was in charge of West Bank and Gaza in perpetuity. This kind of thinking, one-state reality leading to some kind of one state from the river to the sea, I think that is dead now. Whatever, some naive people might think. I think that the two-state solution has been revived as the only solution simply because there is so much despair and hatred now on the Israeli and the Palestinian side that it's clear that only separation is feasible. Otherwise, we have eternal war. But nobody knows how that separation can happen. And it's understandable to be totally skeptical. And that, except when you look to the horizon, you realize that's the only way out. Otherwise, continued hell. Kill 3 Hamas leaders in 2 months. Ultimately, there'll be 3 more if Gaza is just left to stew in the wreckage. So then, what are the immediate possibilities? Israel says it doesn't want to reoccupy Gaza, but its military will control security for a transition period. The United States says it doesn't want Israel to reoccupy. It's hard to see, given the current situation, how Israel will not be forced to reoccupy. Even if it technically pulls out beyond the boundaries of Gaza, creates a buffer zone, it's hard to see how troops won't continually be coming in. In that situation, if Israeli troops keep coming in, I can't see who's going to come in and administer the Gaza Strip, which is going to be a ruin after that, without schools, hospitals, housing, you name it. Maybe the water will be turned back on and there'll be some electricity, but people will be living literally in the ruins. Thoughts that have been thrown out by think tanks. An Arab force will come in and govern. No Arab country wants to get involved in that. A NATO force will come in. No NATO force is going to get involved in that, especially in both cases, since you will be having Israeli forces coming back in to keep trying to eliminate Hamas. And if you don't have them coming back in, neither NATO nor Arab countries is going to want to be in there doing Israel's job in killing Hamas. A UN force? No way. UN forces have proved totally unable to operate in continued military warfare situations. They have to get a special Chapter 7 authorization, and inevitably they pull out of the way. There are no UN forces that would be created where countries would volunteer their men to go in and fight a war inside Gaza. So where do we go from that? An international trusteeship is another one, but the UN, again, is not going to take on rule. Now, what the U.S. has asked for is for the Palestinian Authority, which technically governs the West Bank, to come back into Gaza. You'll remember that they were kicked out by Hamas in 2007, and they were defeated by a plurality in elections in 2005. The Palestinian Authority has an 87-year-old leader, Mahmoud Abbas. He has no credibility. The Palestinian police force in the West Bank has been helping Israel keep Hamas down in the West Bank. It cannot go into Gaza and do the same thing. It would be seen as Israel's Hessians, so to speak. Israel's doing Israel's duty. They would be considered traitors. They're already being considered traitors in the West Bank. So how do you get to a point where you can rebuild Gaza and maybe get to two states? Very tricky. And I think this is what everyone is thinking about. In order to create a legitimate Palestinian Authority, you would have to have elections. But if you had elections, after all the killing of civilians in Gaza, people might vote for Hamas in protest. If you don't have elections, there's no legitimacy. And in order to do any of this, you have to change the government in Israel. And we're not going to change it, the US. But it means there has to be new elections in Israel. Because the Netanyahu government, Netanyahu himself, has said, no two-state solution, no Palestinian Authority returns to Gaza. And there is a huge opposition to Netanyahu in Israel, but it's not clear how you get rid of him. So far, he's not going to resign. He has a majority in the Israeli parliament. And as with the GOP here, none of them want to give up their seats in order to get rid of a leader, even though they know it's a leader that more than half of Israel wants to go, probably. So there's so many balls of string to unravel. I think the first is the government in Israel has to change, and that's an internal Israeli struggle. Concurrent with that, the strategy in Gaza has to change. Israel cannot keep killing civilians. And if Israel pulls back, no matter what tactic it intends to use in the future for security, then the questions become more real about who is going to govern Gaza. And then the questions become more real about whether you can have peace in Gaza and on the West Bank unless there's a political horizon. And then the discussions become more real about a political horizon. As we're almost out of time, I will add one huge caveat to this. If all of this drags on until Donald Trump enters the fray in 2024, and should he be elected, I think the fear in Israel, in many observers here, certainly I think in smart observers of the Israeli scene, is that he will return to only I can solve it and basically give Israel carte blanche for anything, which could take us back to square one, or if nothing has been solved in Gaza, head us further towards larger scale warfare in the region. However, I believe without some future path for a political horizon to the Palestinians, which after all of the pain and suffering begins to be alleviated, might become clear to both populations, Israelis and Gazans, and certainly West Bankers. And with a new government in Israel, if it ever comes, there might ultimately be a desire for negotiations. I don't know whether Netanyahu will go down. I don't know whether a Trump leadership would ever endorse that. If Biden remains in the White House, perhaps 2 or 3 years down the road, you would have a rising tide of new thought that could lead to negotiations based on the fact that both populations in Israel and with the Palestinians understand that force only leads to more of what we see today. And without a political solution for the Palestinian population, we are doomed to more of what we see today over and over and over again. I'll stop there.
Wow. Thank you so much, Trudy, for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you so much to everybody that's watching. We really appreciate it. If you can direct friends who missed today's event to inquirer.com/live, where it will be posted shortly. And also, Trudy has another Inquirer Live event coming up on Friday that you can register at inquirer.com/live. Trudy will be interviewing retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who's a former commander of the U.S. Army Europe of United States Army. Trudy, what is his title? The general's title?
Former commander, U.S. Army Europe is fine. And he is one of the top experts on Ukraine and has so much to say about how Ukraine could still win if two things happen. Congress reverses this benighted 1938-like refusal to renew weapons support for Ukraine. And if Biden decides he really wants Ukraine to win, as he said on television at a press conference today with President Zelensky of Ukraine. So I hope you'll join me at 11 a.m. on Friday for could Ukraine still win if we didn't refuse to give them more weapons and support.
Well, thank you for saying that so much better than I could. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Have a good night.